Hello, everyone. It's 1 o'clock now. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Chris Soley, and I'm the webinar coordinator here at the Center for Disaster Research and Education. So I want to welcome you to the first webinar in the Center for Disaster Research and Education's series entitled 90%. The United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction published a study late last year that determined 90% of the world's major disasters in the last 20 years were weather-related. In this webinar series, our speakers will focus on these natural disasters and how society can better plan for, respond to, and recover from these events. Today, we are privileged to have FEMA meteorologist Rebecca Jennings as our featured speaker. Rebecca Jennings is a meteorologist with FEMA Region 4 with over 15 years of experience in meteorology, communication, and emergency management. She currently serves as regional subject matter expert and team lead for daily analysis of meteorological data, providing detailed decision support, interpretation, and application of weather information through threat and hazard analysis, technical briefings for various internal teams and key stakeholders, and serves as a key advisor to senior leadership in order to better respond to the wide variety of potential hazardous weather threats across the Southeast United States. Since 2007, Ms. Jennings has served as regional risk analysis for numerous presidentially declared major disasters, including the 2008 Super Tuesday tornado outbreak, the 2009 Kentucky ice storm, the 2010 Nashville flood, the 2011 Southeast tornado super outbreak, Hurricane Irene in 2011, and Hurricane Isaac in 2012, and Hurricane Arthur in 2014, the 2014 severe winter ice storms in Georgia and South Carolina, and the 2015 South Carolina flooding, along with many other significant weather events across FEMA Region 4. As the regional team lead for the FEMA Hurricane Liaison Team, she and the team ensure the successful mutual missions of FEMA and the National Hurricane Center. She has deployed to the National Hurricane Center for numerous events since 2008. Ms. Jennings has been recognized for her leadership and performance, receiving the FEMA Administrator's Award for Excellence, FEMA Region 4 Employee of the Quarter, Atlanta Federal Executive Board Distinguished Executive Leadership Development Cohort, and team recipient of the Outstanding Achievement Award from the National Hurricane Conference. Ms. Jennings received her Bachelor of Science degree in Communication from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and her Master of Science degree in Earth and Atmospheric Science from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. And so without further ado, I'd like to present our featured speaker, Ms. Rebecca Jennings. Are you there, Rebecca?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. I hope my talk today will give you a feel for, I think the title of your series is very aptly titled, that 90% of what folks here in our office have to worry about is weather, but they have another important 10% that they deal with. But I am an important piece of what emergency managers have to get information about, and they're not meteorologists, so I do interact a lot with various folks here at FEMA, so hopefully you'll get a better feel for what a meteorologist at FEMA does and some of the various lessons learned I have had in different groups that I work with. Chris, let me ask you, do you need to advance the slides, or can I advance them? Looks like I can. So a meteorologist for FEMA sounds awesome. Chris mentioned some of the things that I worked on, but some of you are wondering, what exactly is it that you do? And the nice thing about emergency management is that no 2 days are the same. But when I tell people this, especially when I mentioned that I'm part of the Hurricane Liaison team, I joke that my sister thinks the word liaison is like a concierge. I'm the liaison for this natural disaster. I'll be helping you have an enjoyable experience. That's not what I do. When people hear I'm a meteorologist, and I think my mom probably still thinks this, that a hurricane liaison, that I'm going to Miami, she envisions me like going into a hurricane. And sometimes the hurricanes do affect Miami, but not all the time. I'm certainly not part of the hurricane hunters, nor am I a broadcast meteorologist, which my 2 children think that I am and like to tell me what the weather is going to be. And if I'm not on my toes and know what the forecast is here at home in Atlanta, they let me know. And then there's this joke, and we get this a lot. Meteorologist does not mean that I am forecasting, and I'm sure you've all heard this, chance of keeping your job if you're wrong all the time. We get that joke quite a bit. And lastly, just because I work for the Department of Homeland Security, I am not Claire Danes, and I don't know any crazy secrets of DHS. I just stick to the weather. And fortunately, I think that I've got one of the easier tasks here in FEMA. So my role primarily as a liaison is to take all of this information that's out there about weather, and our leadership hears it just like anyone else does. We've got a lot of competing voices now in the atmosphere, so to speak, for weather information, and a lot of different ways to get that information. So my role is really to help tease out what the most important pieces of that information are, and what are the critical pieces that are going to help us as we posture from a federal perspective. So I start with this quote from our Administrator Fugate, and this is a picture of some of the damage from Hurricane Sandy, and it's a picture of storm surge damage, which we focus very heavily on as part of the National Hurricane Program. And the quote is that Rick, and in this case that's referring to Dr. Knabb, understands that his mission is not to produce the perfect forecast, but to change the outcome of the event. And for me, that's really my challenge as well, not to just give them weather information and data and spaghetti plots and facts and figures and highs and lows, but really what are the key pieces I can share with them in that analysis. And to do that, I have to have a lot of knowledge about what questions they already are going to have, be able to anticipate what their needs are, have knowledge what our plans are, and be able to frame the information I share with them accordingly. And another quote, this one from Dr. Uccellini, perfect forecasts don't save lives without the infrastructure to disseminate them, and an understanding of how best to communicate to spur individuals to take action. So again, I'm not the one actually making forecasts on a day-to-day basis. I am trying to, from all of the information that's available, get those key pieces that really are going to be most important to us. So one thing I mentioned with the Sandy slide, when it comes to hurricanes, the big battle, our biggest motivating driver is storm surge. And surprisingly to me, because I live and breathe this, but not surprisingly, most people don't know what storm surge is. And it's a challenge to communicate. But we spend in the hurricane program about $1 million or so, give or take, dollars a year with our coastal communities mapping their storm surge risk and finding the best ways to create evacuation zones, do transportation studies, behavioral studies to determine who's at risk, what's at risk, and how long it will take them to evacuate. And with all that information, it's not a FEMA study, but then the local and state emergency managers are able to develop their plans for evacuations, and they really hold the pieces as far as the responsibility to evacuate, and it's different for each of our states. So in FEMA Region 4, our states coastal go from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina. So that's a lot of coastline to cover. And our states, the evacuation call may be made by the governor, and some of them, it might be made by the county emergency manager, and in some of them, it's a little mix of both. So our greatest challenge from that perspective is really how we communicate and how we help them communicate that information to the public.
Rebecca, I think we lost your audio. Are you still there?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened. But so what's being shown right now is a storm surge map from South Carolina. And so this is our hurricane evacuation studies, which again are constantly ongoing. And we use the SLOSH model from NOAA to plot, basically overlay the maximum inundation that you might see for various scenarios. So a category 1 storm, the maximum of maximums is plotted. That might be 6 feet. The maximums for category 2 might be 4 feet, and so on and so forth until you get all the way inland to 5 feet. Or I'm sorry, category 5 storm. So we give them the maximum potential inundation based on the modeling, and they can use this then to create evacuation zones. And we provide some guidance for them, but we don't actually do it for them. So here's a glimpse of the SLOSH model, if you're not familiar with it. And we run this again, we take category 1 storms coming from all different directions, we vary the speed, we vary the intensity, all of that, and produce this maximum envelope for category 1s, category 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, so that, a lot of people think some of these decisions may be political in nature or maybe made on the fly. They may think, don't you just ask people to leave like right before the storm? Well, no, there's actually a method to this, and it's very comprehensive. And emergency managers have these plans well in advance so they can sit down with their key stakeholders and all agree on what their protocols and procedures are going to do. So the meteorology and the storm surge behind it really drives our country's evacuation procedures. Here's a picture of, we work very closely, obviously, with the National Hurricane Center. They're part of what we call the National Hurricane Program. Our core partners are FEMA, the Hurricane Center, NOAA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. And so we're working year-round with them. And most of you have probably seen the new tools and products that they've unveiled for this season and last season and the year before, I think, with Arthur. And some of the new products that will be yet to come. And it's really been a several years in the making where we've moved from all text, all caps products to describe what I basically said is the primary factor for evacuations in our country, to be able to provide pictures to folks. And we work very closely with Jamie Rome and the Storm Surge Unit and Director NAB in using some of these. And it's interesting because with each storm, again, we live and breathe these products, and we think we know what they mean. And each storm that we get, we've only had 2 now that we've been able to test drive these products, so to speak. And both times we've learned a lot about the interpretation, the analysis, what gets people's attention, what doesn't. And so we're starting to understand more about how emergency managers may or may not understand storm surge information, which is critically important to us. So that was an example from Hurricane Arthur. So once we have figured out what is critical information, and I mentioned for hurricanes, the most critical pieces of information are usually how bad is the storm surge going to be and what is the timing for the onset of tropical storm force winds, because those are the 2 factors that determine evacuation timing, who needs to leave, and how bad it will be, how many people need to leave, and where they need to go. So once we have this, and again, this is not done on the fly. Once there's a forecast, it's done in planning, year-round effort. Once we have this, how do we relay it? And how do we do it in real time? And that's the other big challenge that we face. And I like this quote: the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. just because you tell someone something and you think you've understood it doesn't mean that they understand it. It doesn't mean that they have the capacity to do anything about it. And it doesn't mean that it was answering any questions they may have had or actually will change the outcome. So we really actively work with a lot of folks in planning, in recovery, in mitigation, and other groups to understand their plans and their drivers so we can proactively anticipate and tailor what we brief as we relay the information. And, as I said, in terms of dissemination, this used to be a problem. It used to be where the hurricane liaison team actually had to help get the information out. But everyone now has access to computers and cell phones and all of that. So we've moved a long way from faxing this information out, which I can remember doing not that long ago during the 2004 season, to everyone and their brother has basically a personal computer probably sitting right next to you, at least one. I've got two sitting right here next to my computer, and so they can get the information. But do they know what they're looking at, and do they know whether it's important to them, or do they understand that maybe some of that information is relevant to some groups, but maybe not to you? So that becomes then our challenge. And the Hurricane Liaison Team was really developed for this purpose. Our goal is to facilitate the flow of communication. So during a hurricane, the hurricane specialists at the Hurricane Center can focus on the forecast, and we become essentially the producers, the TV producers, the video conference producers, the teleconference producers, getting that information out there. So we have 2 full-time employees that are year-round FEMA employees that work at the National Hurricane Center. And when something is going on in the tropics, one of us from one of the FEMA regions will deploy then down to that Hurricane Center and help do that. So we have a variety of different ways and a lot of different partners and audiences with whom we collaborate, with the end goal being, do you have the information you need? Do you understand it? And how can we tailor this information to help you with your triggers, your criteria, and any questions? So again, our goal is to augment that communication, and this is an example of one of our video teleconferences. I believe this is from Irene. It's a partnership between the Weather Service and FEMA, and the Hurricane Center in 1995 really invited us to do this because they recognized the importance of getting this information out and that they can't do it alone. And the Weather Service can't do it alone. It's a way for us to amplify their messages, but also directly reach out to our partners. Almost all of my states in Region 4 have a state point of contact for me who might be a meteorologist or a hurricane program manager who's familiar with their evacuation information and done the study with us. And that's who I am constantly communicating with, their state directors and those people, letting them know if there's going to be an anticipated change in the forecast, letting them know, our weather service is briefing 3 to 5 feet of storm surge, but the storm surge graphic says this, and the text product says this, and on air they're saying this. What's the right answer? We can help them understand, put that into context. And so this slide is an example of some of the moving parts that are involved. And I use Legos because it's really quite a cast of characters, a lot of different folks at play. I'll start with the one that many of us know and love, which is our meteorologists. Obviously, we aren't making the forecasts. We rely very heavily and solely on the information coming from the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service offices. And we don't compete with their messaging. We're not providing redundant information, but a lot of meteorologists are shocked, floored even, when they find out that not only do people sometimes not understand their message, but they're too afraid to ask. And so meteorologists assume that people are taking the information they provide and doing something with it. But that's not always the case. So that's where we come into play. As the relay racers, we're not just handing off the baton of the message, but then we're responsible for all of these teams in the field. They could be FEMA teams, they could be emergency management at the state office level or at the local level, doing these briefings and picking out the information say we know there's a lot of confusion about which storm surge product they should be using, we can direct the Hurricane Center director, or if James Franklin or if Rappaport is briefing, whomever, we can sort of steer them in the right direction to focus on things that might be the most important impact, like storm surge or rainfall or whatever the most important impact might be. It's always tricky because you don't know what the end user has in mind. So one of our close collaborators are our planners. And again, we work year round to tell them things about what products are available so that they know that at 10 days, there is no National Hurricane Center.
Just be 1 second while Rebecca reconnects. Sorry about the delay. Rebecca, we're having trouble hearing you still. Are you there, Rebecca? We can't hear you. You might have to click the mic button down there at the bottom, just because it kicked you out and kicked you back in.
Oh, yeah, it does keep doing that. Okay, so this is a picture of Brandon Belinsky, who's the Hurricane Program Manager here in Region 4. At the Hurricane Liaison team, our office is just about that big, and he's just talking to folks on the other end, going over some of the details of the forecast. And again, they can read it right off the website, but it helps that we have relationships with these emergency management managers, and we work with them year round, so we know what their triggers and their critical information is, and we can speak emergency management to them and translate it from here's the data and the forecast to, okay, here's how this affects you. Here's what you need to know, and we can help them as they're making those decisions about response and evacuations. Here's an action photo of a very tired Rebecca, and we joke because it's showing the key essential ingredients for the Hurricane Liaison team: coffee, phone, and food. But in this shot, we're actually putting together a video conference presentation, and at the same time, I'm texting someone about the forecast and information. So we're definitely multitaskers when we get down there. And here's a slide I like to show, because if you look up at the screen, it gives you a sense for all of the different players. I didn't have time to make them all in Legos, but it gives you a sense for all of the different players that are involved. Every single box on that screen represents a different audience. And one of those boxes you can see says White House on it, and you never know who is listening or how your information will be interpreted or what key piece of information they're looking for. So from a communication perspective, you have to be able to address that succinctly and provide the information they need, or you won't be asked anymore as a credible expert to provide that information. Fortunately, the Hurricane Center, being such a close year-round product, does an excellent job for us with this. And this is former Director Bill Reed briefing. And the nice thing is, with all of these different players, they're hearing the same message at the same time, cutting out the noise from Twitter or the internet or television and cable and, you know, your brother who has his opinion and anyone else who may want to hype the storm. They're hearing that, all one message at the same time, so we are all in the emergency management community on the same page. So this is one of the good things that we do for hurricanes. One of the challenges we deal with, though, now is that the information is coming even earlier than it used to. So this is an example from Arthur, where we started tracking the storm while it was over land and doing conference calls and briefings before there was even a forecast. So that presents a unique challenge as far as how we relay that information when you don't have a cone of uncertainty. to show folks what the forecast is, and they want to go spaghetti model hunting to try to find out where's it going to go, what's the answer, and unfortunately we don't have those. So we have to really then fall back on our plans for the scenarios and what we've already worked out that we will do in those cases. So Arthur was very unique that it formed and went back up the coast, and some of our lessons learned in terms of disseminating is that words matter, and I was down at the Hurricane Center for this event and would see the forecasters, Dan Brown and folks, nudging the forecast closer and closer to the coast. So because of my involvement with the planning process, I'm able to know that each of those pencil width nudges left toward the coast trimmed back things like evacuation clearance times. It had an impact on whether or not a local Myrtle Beach area, for example, over 4th of July weekend, would need to get people off the beaches, or whether or not those 50-knot winds might impact the community and they needed to set up for that. So we're able to anticipate that before they have to wait for the next 6-hour forecast product to come out and get that information out as quickly as we can. And really, that's the year-round partnership we have with so many folks, and also our ability to talk to them and be that trusted partner during the event. Here's another shot. Now this is from beloved 99L, Tropical Depression 9, Hermine, post-tropical cyclone in remnant low, which was the longest storm that I have been through since Faye, probably. This is Director Nab providing a briefing to FEMA from our Hurricane Liaison Team room. And there were a lot of other folks on this briefing that you can't see, but he's using the 5-day outlook. And in this case, it was another example where we had to use that product to glean information about what we could see in the next 5 days. We didn't have a forecast. The models were all over the place. And we've gone from not ever briefing a model to having to use some of that to inform our decisions. So the question then becomes, do you brief models? Or do you look at all of them and, as a meteorologist, take the pieces, the messages that it's telling us and brief it appropriately? So we work very closely with Dr. Nab and try our best to tackle that challenge. So again, I mentioned this is one example of a graphic we created to help folks understand that when we're beyond 5 days, the federal wheels of the bus may need to start going in order to position resources or stand up logistics commodities or get teams that, for example, during Hermine, when it was still 99L, we had half our agency was in Louisiana for the floods. And it takes a certain amount of time to disengage those teams and reposition them if we would have needed them in North Carolina or Florida. So they want, obviously, as much time as possible to do that, and we're not always able to provide them the answer until very close to the storm. So we have to work with what we have. And this is just an example of how we try to reinforce to folks that the further out you are, the fewer products you have and the more uncertainty in the forecast. And believe it or not, people at the federal level are more comfortable with a large degree of uncertainty, and they're willing to tolerate that because they can't chance the risk that lives are lost or an evacuation doesn't get made. So it's a fine line that we live in between not having all the information you might like to have for the critical decisions that have to be made, typically within this 3-day window, where we're just starting to have watches go up. And this is my final slide. It just kind of demonstrates this point. Nate Silver, the statistician, happens to also love weather in terms of data, and he has a quote that we're not that much smarter than we used to be, even though we have much more information. So that means the real skill is learning how to pick out the most useful information. And in FEMA Region 4, we have 8 states, 30 local National Weather Service forecast offices, 3 National Weather Service regions, and almost every weather hazard except, I think, volcanoes. And if there is an active one in the Southeast, I don't want to know about it because my job, it covers enough as it is. But with every type of weather event, this comes into play. It's not just about a perfect forecast, because if we wait for that, we've probably missed the timeline where the critical decisions have to be made. So it's about providing as much information you can to really change the outcome and provide the informed analysis for decision makers at that time frame. So that's all I had in terms of slides. I'd be happy to answer any questions you all have, either about what I do now, past events, my career, or anything else.
Thank you, Rebecca. And you all can use your audio mic button to ask a question out loud, or else there's also a chat feature over on the right-hand side panel, the little speech bubble. If you click on that, you can get into chat if you don't have a mic available or it's not working. But I'll start out, Rebecca. I can't remember exactly which hurricane it was last fall. I believe it was in October. It might have been Joaquin or maybe Kate. But the cone of uncertainty had it going right up the East Coast and crashing or hitting Delaware, New Jersey right head on. And so like 5 days out, these states were declaring states of emergencies. And so you talked about how that's to get resources in play, but what's the implication for that when these states are doing that? Like, are they wasting a lot of money? Or I guess what's the trade-off there?
Yeah, the state of emergency, you might be talking about Erica. It may have also happened with Kate and probably Joaquin. The state of emergency is actually fairly standard practice where that's just a legalese for emergency managers to indicate that they are requesting or anticipating a situation where they might need additional support. So in emergency management, all disasters are local, and they're handled by the local first responders and the local emergency management community. So if you have an event that might affect 100 people, that's probably something that can be, depends on the locality. It varies everywhere, but probably something that the locals might have resources to respond to. If it gets much above that, it's very typical for them to say, okay, state emergency management, we're going to need some additional support, especially when you get into things that might be like roadway networks that could be impacted, things that they don't own. And if they anticipate either needing reimbursed for some of their actions or that some citizens may need some support afterwards, that's very standard for them to then go to the state, and then the state will declare it, quote unquote, state of emergency. And at that point, not asking for a disaster request, they're just activating their state EOC so they can monitor the event. So I'm not sure why that particular, I know in Erica it received a lot of attention that Miami-Dade had gone to a state of emergency for an event, and it really didn't change any actions on the back end of that. It just got their wheels ready in case, which is in essence the trade-off. You can't take the risk that something is going to happen and not be prepared to respond. You have to be ready. So, but again, that really doesn't imply that any federal dollars are being spent or any reimbursements happening or taking place, or that anyone is going to get, you know, a FEMA check or anything afterwards. It's just really getting people ready.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to follow up with that, I guess the state of emergency, you know, we live in the day and age of social media, so that's like immediately broadcast, as you said, out to anyone and everyone. So do you feel like that's the right kind of terminology, or what else can you say when you say state of emergency to kind of keep people, you know, hey, there's still a possibility that this other scenario where it was one of the hurricanes that it was going to go into the East Coast, but then it turned right and just went out into the Atlantic. So how can you kind of
it comes up, you know, it came up, it seems like a lot the past couple of years, particularly when like the governor has a press conference and announces it. And I'm not sure that it was language that was ever really intended to be directed for the public. There's a lot of emergency management federal policies and laws in place, and it happens to be a requirement in terminology there, so I can understand how it would evoke nervous reaction from people. It might be part of the intention is to get folks, where is your emergency plan? Well, now it's time to do that. It's time to make sure you have water, batteries, that your car is fueled up, that you have your prescriptions just in case. So there's an argument to be made that perhaps for the public, it is sort of an action on their part, but I can see how some feel that maybe it's would desensitize them a bit for a more serious event. On the other hand, it really in this case is internal baseball, so to speak, policy that is required by law for us to go through in order for different levels of support to be provided. So I'm not sure that the emergency management community is going to be responsible for changing that language because it's embedded everywhere in the legal process. However, I think the media is a key partner with emergency managers, and it's definitely something that's an ongoing conversation. The best emergency managers have a great relationship with their media partners, and the more we are able to tailor a message to say what we mean and what specific actions we want the public to take, the better we'll be. Just as an example, we have a lot of places now, South Carolina, who don't call for voluntary evacuations anymore. When they get up and the governor issues an evacuation order, it's considered mandatory. If it's not, then they don't issue an evacuation order. So they've got a lot of supporting language now to go with that. It's still policy. It's still, all somewhat inside baseball, but they've changed the messaging. So I think that is something that between the emergency management community, the weather service, some of that is happening at the local levels through the IWTs, the integrated weather teams, integrated marine teams. But on a bigger scale, we really haven't had those conversations yet about what some of our things do to the public.
Thank you. That helps a lot. Does anybody else have any other questions for Rebecca? Okay, I'll read this for Min.
Okay.
He says thank you, and he joined a little late due to technical issues. Oftentimes, FEMA is expected to bail out folks post-disaster and offer assistance. How do you educate people on what FEMA can do after a disaster? In terms of disaster assistance, individual assistance, public assistance, etc.
Well, I fortunately don't have to get into that lane very much. I do a lot of training, and my training is primarily directed at emergency managers and talking about weather-related hazards and how looking for those hazards and knowing the best resources to get that information really helps us when we go operational. So I don't do very much public-facing outreach, and I don't do a lot or anything with post-disaster assistance. So I'm certainly not an expert. I have learned a lot about it myself, even since joining FEMA. I will say there is a huge misconception publicly about what can be a very confusing process. It's definitely not simple, and it's not cut and dry. I'm not sure about the word bail out, but I do know that a lot of communities work very hard on mitigation efforts to try to do things to make communities more resilient. As an example, we're talking right now about storm surge. And I don't know if everyone had the opportunity to see the new prototype storm surge watch warning products, but their threshold is 3 feet for that. And they consider that in the language that they're using now in the prototype is life-threatening storm surge. And for us, folks on the Gulf Coast, when they hear language that says life-threatening, they panic. They would think Katrina. And when our leadership saw that for Hermine, they thought oh my goodness, life-threatening. And when we told them what that meant, they didn't pay attention at all, because 3 feet, if your homes in that community have all been elevated well above that, if you have had lots of low-lying areas that have been purchased by the community and now are not habited by anybody, if you have those types of mitigation things in place, it may not actually affect anybody. And I know that that is one of FEMA's big goals, is to invest more heavily in mitigation efforts that help with the post-disaster process. And in terms of what individual assistance and public assistance is available, it's definitely way outside my lane. And fortunately, I don't have to get into all the nuts and bolts of that. We have an entire recovery division that does a lot of outreach with that.
Thank you. And it looks like Christopher Davis, he was wondering if you could give us a rundown of the path you took to work for FEMA, from undergrad to grad school. Was working at FEMA what you always wanted to do with meteorology?
You know, my path is very crooked and winding, and I didn't even know FEMA existed, really, for when I was way back in the day of undergrad. I was a meteorology major, and I always wanted to be a meteorologist. I always thought that I would be doing something probably more research-oriented. And when I got to my undergrad, I realized that my interest was really in communication, and I actually dropped my meteorology degree, which was my love in life. And it ended up being one of the best things I ever did, because I had a communication degree, and I went to the private sector for a while, and then I was able to go back to grad school and combine my interests once I had my graduate degree in meteorology. And I learned that after grad school, I worked at the Weather Channel actually for several years. That's how I got interested in hurricanes. Still didn't know that much about it. Attention, and with my communication background, I knew that what I wanted to do was help with the messaging in hurricanes. And I would never be the best forecaster out there, and that computer models were going to beat me faster every time. And you know, the Hurricane Center, they have the best when it comes to track forecasts and modeling. There's a reason why we use their forecasts in terms of accuracy and precision. But what I could do was help people understand what they were looking at. So at the Weather Channel, I started to work with emergency managers more, and that's how I learned about FEMA and what they were doing. So when the position came up at FEMA, it was right after Katrina, and FEMA was probably at an all-time low in terms of public opinion, and people thought I was crazy. But yes, at that time, this was ultimately my quote-unquote dream position, being able to work with emergency managers and hurricane vulnerability, and as a communication person, combining the best of both worlds. I do not think that I would be helping folks, because my role now in meteorology is I'm helping with ice storms and floods and tornadoes, and applying what we learned from hurricanes, which are slower evolving typically event on a bigger scale, taking some of those best practices. And usually, if you ever hear best practice or go through what we call hot washes or lessons learned, communication almost always comes up as one of the things that needs improvement. And if we can solve some of those issues, it's usually not like, well, the Weather Service really blew that forecast. It's usually, how can we improve communication? So I really enjoy that aspect of my job. That being said, you know, it always is disappointing when the forecasts aren't what we would hope they had been, and there's plenty of times when the forecast is one thing and the weather has tricks up its sleeve and ends up doing something else. So that's part of the challenge.
Were there any other questions? Ryan would like to know, do you ever interact with Daniel Porter at FEMA headquarters for forecasts? He's the NOAA liaison to FEMA, or do you usually focus more on the region state level communication?
I interact with Daniel on a daily basis. One of the things I do is there's 10 FEMA regions, and then there's our FEMA headquarters, and then as you go down the tree, there's headquarters, regions, states, counties, locals. But I like to make sure for consistency purposes, if Daniel is briefing something to headquarters, if I were to be briefing something different to my region, obviously there'd be a disconnect. So we are always communicating, making sure we're on the same page. If I have any questions about what I'm seeing, I'll ask him, hey, what do you think? He'll ask me. He has a special interest in convective weather and tornadoes. He'll come to me for hurricane questions. We both just try to get through the winter questions. Sometimes I'll know a resource or he'll know a resource. We also have liaisons at the Storm Prediction Center, and then, as I mentioned, 2 full-time liaisons at the Hurricane Center, and we talk weekly, if not daily as well, sometimes more often if there's something going on. And soon to come, they would like to have a FEMA liaison at the National Water Center for some of the hydro events. So, and we actually have started recently working more closely with the WPC in terms of winter weather events. So that is definitely a part of our role as liaison, is making sure that that clear, consistent message, if Daniel's telling them, well, this flooding event's going to produce 6 to 8 inches, and he's using the 3-day QPF. If I brief 10 to 12 inches and I'm using the 7-day QPF, that really doesn't do folks any good, because they'll just get confused, and then they'll get an angry call from Administrator Fugate if they're not doing what headquarters thinks that they should be doing based on briefing. So yeah, that's all part of the liaison gig.
Very good.
Were there any other questions?
And Ryan, yes, Daniel is awesome, and I will let him know that he got a shout out.
You know, Ryan?
Okay, well, thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. And a special thank you to our speaker, Ms. Jennings, for all your time and help and reaching out to us and providing us with all this great information. So if anybody wants her contact info, I'd be happy to pass it on, if that's all right, your email address. And thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.